This land is cold-blooded. It butchers the weak and has annihilated civilizations. Even so, there are those who have risen to tower above the beast that is Skyrim. Some are beings of incredible power, casting a shadow across the land, while others flow without trace, leaving a profound peace as the only mark of their passing influence. This is a record of the shadows, an accounting of the marks left on history by the ones who would not be crushed by this land. This is Expedition Skyrim.
Welcome, dear viewers, to CouchWarriorTV on YouTube. I am the Couch Warrior, and you are watching Expedition Skyrim, Volume 1, The Demon Hunter. This is episode number 1 of our series on the Demon Hunter character build from Tamriel Vault, created by No Snakes Alive. And in this episode, we are going to be setting the stage for the rest of the series. So we'll be talking a little bit in this episode about the build itself, about the mods that'll be in use here, and about our primary protagonist in the story. So we're going to get a little bit of sort of technical build information, as well as some detailed information on the character that we'll be playing, her background, and some of the tools that we use here at Character Crusade to help develop characters and give them color and make them sort of rich and vibrant and sort of have a place in the world, if you will. So this episode is going to basically be mirrored in all the series that come up. So every time that we do a character build series, it'll start with an episode like this, where we kind of set the table for what we're going to be talking about going forward, making sure that we're all speaking the same language and that we have properly set things up so that we can kind of have a successful and fun adventure and kind of kick the discussion off with a good accounting of where we stand at the moment, what we plan on changing, and then what we're going to do in terms of character development. So, as I said, this is the Demon Hunter Volume 1, and our objectives are to kind of understand the fundamentals of the build and get to know the character at the same time. In order to do this, we're going to be talking about some of the details that are laid out by No Snakes Alive in this build document on Tamriel Vault. So, let's get started. The build that we're focused on, of course, is the Demon Hunter, which is really kind of focused on close combat, magic, and a very unique use of ranged weapons. I really like this one because I do love archery, but I like the concept of sort of a stand-up archer in heavy armor who's really doing some unique things with a bow. So there's going to be a lot of fun here. What are the basics? This is a vanilla build, so it's focused on the bow, but with no sniper tactics. This build is really about battlefield control, and we're going to be using restoration and shouts and destruction to do these things. Heavy armor is considered preferable for this, but He also provides some good information on how you could do this with light armor. It's actually a remarkably flexible build in that way, so there's a lot of different directions you can take this, which I think is great. No melee weapons. So when we say bow, we mean bow, strictly. And we will be using bow in some cases almost as if it were a melee weapon. So that's what I find particularly intriguing about this build, using the kind of bow smash technique to stun enemies and so forth. What we're seeing here, the footage that you're watching, is some of my test play footage as I had created the character and kind of tooling around with Lydia here and trying to bring a follower into the mix to see how that all works. So as the build is laid out, we've got not too many perks here. The major skills are archery, restoration, and alchemy. Minor skills being heavy armor, destruction, alteration, and smithing. And if you look at the document, there is a level 55 perk spread if you're interested in checking out what he recommends specifically for this. The distribution of attributes is not really defined in the build document. I think that's flexible. What I chose to do in my case was really just divide my attribute points equally between magicka and health. As far as gear is concerned, this build is kind of inspired by a character type from Diablo 3 called the Demon Hunter, and so his gear recommendations are kind of based on that aesthetic, which is to say heavy armor and a hood. And he mentions more than once that he likes the combination of the Nordic carved armor and then the adept hood. So you can try that on for yourself. In my particular case with this character, I am using a mod to outfit her. The shouts we're going to be focused on are slow time, whirlwind sprint, ice form, and unrelenting force. The thing that these kind of all have in common is that they're really great sort of crowd control type items and escape. So ice form is basically the equivalent of paralysis. Unrelenting force is the equivalent of a stun. Whirlwind sprint allows us to quickly change position, and slow time allows for the same thing, change of position, as well as some other cool advantages from an offensive perspective. So those are the focus. Of course, you can mix it up with a whole bunch of different shouts, but those will be the focus of some of the special moves that are part of this build. As far as spells go, we're going to dual cast flames, we're going to use fire runes, we're going to use ash runes, the whirlwind cloak, the guardian circle from the restoration perk tree, or the restoration spell tree, and then also healing and flesh spells. So we'll kind of get to explore this a bit more in practice, but the idea really is to just stand up, and fire straight at your enemies with a guardian circle around yourself, and then force them to run through a bunch of fire rune traps to get to you. It's really kind of funneling them into your traps. The recommended weapons here are Zephyr for its high fire rate, and the enhanced dwarven crossbow, which ignores 50% of enemy armor, also has all those cool specialty bolts you can craft for flame and all those kind of cool things. The Dawnguard DLC is going to be required for that crossbow, and also for Zephyr, I believe. Dragonborn is going to be required for the Ash Rune spell. The Ash Rune spell is very cool. Obviously a rune spell, but it has the effect of temporarily paralyzing anybody who runs over it, which is great for controlling the flow of the enemies around the battlefield. So as far as mods go, I think the main thing to note here is that we are going to be using the Ordinator perk overhaul. And the Ordinator perk overhaul will be used in just about all of the character concept videos that I do. This overhaul is going to allow for much more efficient use of perks. So our perk spread becomes very interesting when we get into things like Ordinator. There's additional flexibility there for heavy armor. The author recommends not taking any perks in heavy armor besides the basic armor improvement ones, or the root level perks in the heavy armor tree, because you're wearing a hood, you're never wearing full armor and really can't benefit from some of those perks that give you bonuses based on wearing all heavy armor. Well, we're able to get around that with Ordinator and do some interesting things. So definitely worth doing. We can also make much more deadly use of our restoration spells using Ordinator. We have some very cool options in there, and we'll kind of see those, I think, in action quite prominently throughout the play series. There are some options there that really kind of do extra damage on the battlefield and potentially heal your comrades as well, those fighting with you, in sort of a passive manner, so you don't really have to even think about it too much, which I really kind of appreciate. It lets you focus on the battle, but gives you this sense of power that I think should come with a character of this type that's really, focused on fighting the undead, So let's get to know our primary character. Her name is Korvelain. She is a Breton transplant from High Rock to Skyrim, and she comes from a noble family with a tradition of military service. So as we look at her, I try to break things down a little bit. The first thing I thought about is, how do I explain this idea of why only a bow? And we're going to get into this in some detail. And I latched on to that one detail of this build, and I used it to build an entire background and personality for this character, which is based on an old childhood trauma and how that affects her as she progresses to adulthood. Her strengths are a desire to never be vulnerable. This drives her to succeed. She's very strong-willed. She has these perfectionist tendencies and a very overdeveloped work ethic. She's a logical thinker. She's goal-oriented, highly adaptable. Her weaknesses, however, are feelings of failure as a result of her limited ability and fear of the sword. And we'll get into that after we get through these details in a bit more focus, I guess. She has a difficulty empathizing with people. A fear of commitment, a tendency to push beyond the physical limits, and is extremely self-critical. She's viewed by others to be unemotional, but certain triggers can send her into these kind of periods of extreme, irrational, emotional response, which are generally uncharacteristic of her. So what's her vulnerability? It really boils down to a fear of failure, and a fear of rejection. One could say that the fear of failure is driven by this fear of rejection. And these triggers can cause this uncharacteristic response that can cause her to push people away and confuse the people that love her. So I think that those are the basics. But the question is, how do we piece all of these things together? And hey, Couch Warrior, how did you get all that from the fact that she only uses a bow and doesn't use a sword? Well, I find it very helpful when creating a character and wanting to create some depth to their personality to find something to key on, something unusual about that character that I can key off of and start developing a story around. And one of the most unusual things about this build is the fact that there is no one-handed weapon. There is no two-handed weapon. It's not that kind of a build. So I immediately grabbed onto that. So let's talk a little bit about her story. I'm going to tell you Korvelain's story now. Who is she and how did she get here? What does she think she needs, and what does she really need? Those are the kinds of questions I like to try and answer. And most of the time, I try not to focus too much on background stories. In other words, I try not to invest too much energy in crafting a background story before I even start playing the character. However, in this particular case, it felt natural, it felt right to try to explain who she is at this moment by understanding in quite a bit more detail how this whole focus on the bow and the absence of a sword came to be. because it was so unusual and interesting. And that's one of the things I like about these builds that we see on Tamriel Vault, is almost all of them have some kind of an interesting hook that allows you to dig deeper and kind of come up with an interesting premise that explains what that unusual feature is. So let's talk about Korvelain. As I said before, she comes from a family with a rich sort of military tradition. And by that I mean, she comes from what I would consider to be the equivalent of an upper middle class family, or perhaps lower nobility in High Rock. And by a history of military service, I basically mean, her brother serves, her father serves, her uncles serve, her aunts serve. She can probably trace her military service back through great grandparents, both male and female. So there's this long tradition of military service. And as I had mentioned before, there's this deep sort of childhood trauma that essentially kind of defines who she is as she grows up and makes her who she is. At a young age, as kind of as an adolescent, let's say, she is taken by her father on a diplomatic mission. Her father is a soldier, is an officer, and his military unit is going to be escorting a group of politicians who are going to a meeting of some importance, and he feels she's old enough now that he can bring her along. She can see the world, she can understand more about government, all these things, right? Kind of like a field trip, if you will. No trouble is expected. It's kind of a milk run, right? But during that trip, this diplomatic entourage is attacked by a group of fanatical necromancers. We don't really know anything about what their ideology is. We don't know what the reason for the attack was, but we can assume it was politically motivated. During this attack, Korvelain is nearly killed. But not only that, she is nearly killed by the resurrected body of a beloved uncle. Someone who is killed in the raid, resurrected by necromancers, and nearly murders her in the process. And she finds herself too weak and too inexperienced and too young to know how to defend herself with the sword that she picks up. She is narrowly saved by her father, and from that point on, that trauma becomes a recurring theme in her life. She has nightmares after that of seeing the sword descending and being held in the hands of the man, this uncle that she used to know, but who now has dead eyes and seems intent on killing her. What could be more traumatic than that? So this is kind of a formative experience for her, and the reaction that she has to this is nightmares, and nightmares about being unable to defend herself and being attacked by her uncle, and this experience with the undead, and how awful that type of experience must have been for someone at her age. So this also manifests itself in a PTSD type reaction that she has when she's holding a sword. It brings back the memory of how she was unable to defend herself from this attack with a sword, how in her hands it was essentially useless. It's sort of the equivalent of, having a dream where you're being chased, but for some reason you can't run, or it feels like you're running in water. I think almost everybody has had the experience at some point of a dream like that where you're threatened and somehow unable to flee or defend yourself. Well, this is a recurring issue for her. And not only does it cause her problems, in her dreams, but it does in the real world as well. She picks up a sword, puts it in her hand. She's fine. She can look at it and all that stuff. But the second she's in some kind of a combat situation, whether it's real or simulated, she freezes up and has this PTSD reaction, right? Her family is aware of the issue. They're aware of the nightmares. They're not necessarily aware of the sword fright, if you will. And they attempt to coddle her. They attempt to steer her away from military service. They attempt to, send her off to school. But she rejects that coddling because she is now filled with this overwhelming drive or overwhelming desire to figure out how to defend herself, to be self-reliant, all the while understanding that she's deathly afraid of these weapons. The only thing that she can relate to is her bow, which is a very different experience than actually holding a sword in your hand. So she rejects her family's coddling and encouragement to, go with another line of work, and she goes to the military academy anyway. So that kind of sets the stage for how she comes out of adolescence and into adulthood, and where she is sort of as a young woman, right? So let's explore that a little bit more. So she goes to the military academy, and after a while, her family accepts this. They say, okay, we understand the desire for military service. We've been doing it for years. It's an important thing. We get that she wants to do this, so let's support her. However, they still continue to try and steer her in another direction in subtle ways. One of which is to set her up, basically, with a young man from another noble family, and not necessarily an arranged marriage, but almost like a blind date that turns into something else, if you will. They try to steer her into a more domestic kind of life. Fearing for her and understanding that she has these nightmares and these traumas. They're trying to protect her because they love her, right? So she eventually grows to love this boy. Initially, she rejects him because she sees it as sort of a controlling thing, right? But over time, she comes to love him as she begins to understand that this particular young man has this sort of unconditional acceptance, not only of her, but of her career choice, and encourages her to do what she wants. If she wants to do this military service, if that is important to her, he's encouraging her to do that. And she begins to envision another life for herself, that perhaps it doesn't have to be all about military service. Maybe there's more, right? She works very hard. We know this about her. She's very driven. She's a perfectionist. She's got deep reservoirs of willpower and work ethic. So she works very hard and she excels at everything. But she still suffers the issues with a sword in her hand. The PTSD is still there. It's still lingering down. It's still a problem. And she attempts, as much as possible, to hide that fear from people. But despite all of her efforts to hide it, she simply can't. You can't go to a military academy and expect that you're going to be able to hide the fact that you have this deep-seated fear for very long, right? So eventually what happens is she completes her schooling, and when it comes time to be placed into a unit, she receives basically a rejection letter saying that she is unfit to go into the unit that she wants to go into. Not just that she's unfit because of her personal problems regarding her ability to use this particular weapon, which is, at the very core of what the infantry is all about, but that the fact that she is unable to do this would jeopardize her comrades in battle. And suddenly she goes from not only viewing herself as a failure, but viewing herself as potentially a danger to others. And this is how she sees herself, and this is how she believes everyone else sees her. Well, as I'd mentioned before, certain triggers for her can set off kind of an irrational response. Normally, a woman who is very driven, very organized, very methodical, very logical, suddenly has this trigger, and she goes into a tailspin, and this extreme reaction causes her to flee in shame, thinking she's got to somehow prove herself. So she packs everything up, and she quietly leaves home, and she gets on a ship, and she sails away. Not necessarily seeking her fortune, but seeking to prove herself, and not really understanding completely what it is that she's trying to prove. She just packs her things and leaves, much like someone might do who, gets very angry with a family member, makes up all kinds of, irrational ideas about what other people are thinking, and runs away. And that's essentially what she does. She leaves everyone and everything behind, including this young man who she was only beginning to love, right? And to whom she had promised herself, right? So she packs everything up and she runs away. She ends up in Skyrim. So then she is having to decide, what is the greater shame? Is packing up and leaving without a word a greater shame than coming back to her family, having not accomplished anything? We're talking about someone who's very strong-willed and obviously somewhat stubborn. So the whole idea of her returning back to her family to admit that she made a mistake, having not proven anything to herself, let alone her family, or having any way to sort of justify why she left, probably isn't going to happen. So Korvelain is conflicted, right? And she is the kind of person who faces her fears, I think, in a way that is almost counterproductive, almost destructive. She tends to wallow in her fear of failure. In other words, she doesn't have the ability to cope by compartmentalizing. So she ends up living her fear, living her shame, living all that stuff every day. And we see that exhibited in the fact that you'll notice in the video, this character does carry a sword, but she never uses it. And the sword has a name. The sword is called Korvelain's Fear. And she constantly wears that sword, even though it causes her pain, because it's a constant reminder of her own failure. And for some reason, she believes that she is not allowed to let fear and shame go. So this is kind of a self-flagellation, it's a punishment, right? She's punishing herself every single day for this perceived failure, which we all know logically isn't really her fault at all. But she internalizes this, and the fear, Korvelain's fear, the sword, is just one example of the ways in which she will punish herself over and over and over. She feels that she must attack adversity at all times. And the only way that she finds any solace, any relief from the fear and the shame, is when she feels like she's taking action. And this gets at the heart of the engine that drives her. She is all about action. And if you are taking action against the things that you feel you fear, or the things that are dragging you down, or the things that are making you something less than the perfect person that you want to be, then you feel like you are addressing the issue, even though maybe you aren't, right? And so this is kind of a sort of strange and subconscious ideology that she has, to be constantly on the attack. So that, I think, begs the question, who does she attack? Well, we can trace this back again to her experience, her formative experience, the trauma. She was almost killed by her undead uncle. This is a horror and an abomination, and she has a deep-seated hatred for the undead and those who would create them. And I think that not only do we see this expression in her life's mission, which is to root out the undead, but we see it also reflected in more subtle ways. Her propensity, to wear black, to delve down into these dark places, to be solitary, to not make connections with people, to, I guess, live a darker, more solitary life, perhaps. Not that she is trying to emulate this evil that she's trying to get out of the world, but that after a while, it starts to rub off on her almost, it's like darkness by osmosis, I guess. She immerses herself in darkness for long enough, and pretty soon she becomes that thing that she fears, right? And so I think that we're going to see, this is going to be an interesting exploration. I really love the concept of Korvelain a lot. She's strong, and she's deadly, and she's determined, but she's also flawed, and she's vulnerable. And I think that's what makes a character truly have color. We hear this cliche quite often about three-dimensional characters and stuff. Well, there's some truth to that, right? I mean, a flat character is, a character who's out for revenge. That's a flat character. We don't really understand why. And just explaining why they're out for revenge isn't enough. I mean, I think to really have a fully developed character, we need to really understand the psychology. And so when I break this down, I really like to break it down into strengths and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And in my view, there are some distinct differences between those. So when I think of weaknesses for Korvelain, I think of emotional weaknesses, and I think of tactical weaknesses, right? There's a certain amount of tactical weakness here in that she is not able to use a sword, right? She's not able to engage in melee combat in the traditional sense. So knowing what we do of her and the fact that she is we understand her to be very adaptable. She has adapted to this shortcoming, if you will, right? By using spells and by essentially crafting her own tactical methodology to get around this terrible fear that overwhelms her when she has a blade in her hand. So this is kind of interesting because the whole concept was keyed off this idea of, okay, this is a character who wears heavy armor and just uses a bow. Why is that? And when I started digging deeper into that idea, then these concepts started to pop out, and it became the foundation for a character, which I really love. And one of the things that I really like about these builds, is so many of them have things that you can use in this way. It just requires a little bit of thought, and a little time spent just kind of, sit back, relax, think about the story, think about how it would play out. Because I think what I like about having this sort of a background is now I have enough of a backstory. I had to create just enough backstory so that I had a foundation for what her personality was. And understanding what her personality is, what these vulnerabilities, strengths, and weaknesses are, is absolutely essential for me to understand how to play her going forward and how to make decisions when I'm inhabiting the headspace of Korvelain, right? So now it's kind of interesting to imagine what her priorities are going to be in Skyrim. And I can start thinking about, as we go through this playthrough, What are some of the quests that we're going to pursue? Well, we now know how driven Korvelain is as a person and this personal mission that she has, right? So I can definitely see us going into quite a bit of Dawnguard content. I think, as we're seeing here, any of these barrows are certainly fair game, right? I don't see her necessarily being as obsessed with dragons and fighting dragons and all that kind of stuff, but I see her being very obsessed with vampires. And so when we enter Skyrim and we get that first message from the Dawnguard saying they're forming up, and do you want to join? And what about all these vampire attacks? You can definitely see her responding to that, I guess, and pursuing that. So I definitely think that we will have a fair amount of Dawnguard content in our future here. And we're looking at somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of gameplay here. So I don't know that it's going to be all Dawnguard related. I think we'll try to mix it up a little bit. But I think a lot of it will be, just because it makes a lot of sense with her story. So what can we look forward to here? Well, we've got some background on her, and I think in upcoming episodes, we're going to have some fun adventures, but we're also going to have some interesting discussion about how the perk spread for this vanilla-based character build will be translated using Ordinator. I think we'll get into that in some detail, and we may cover one perk tree per episode. I don't want to go completely crazy with that kind of information in every single episode, but maybe what we'll do is focus on maybe 1 or 2 areas per episode. I think you can expect the upcoming episodes to be anywhere between 45 minutes and an hour long. And, we'll try to hit as much interesting content in the allotted time as we possibly can. And what I'm really looking forward to is discussions with you all regarding how the character plays out, Korvelain specifically, and her personality and the decisions she might make, but also around some of the technical details about how we depict this build properly in a game that is heavily modded, where we're using things like Thunderchild and Ordinator and stuff like that. I'll also be giving you a lot more detail coming up here on the mods that I have in the mix, how she is outfitted. So if you're particularly interested in how she looks and the armor I'm using and all that stuff, it will be fully explained in future episodes. I got to save something for the stuff coming up. But it's going to be a fun exploration. I'm really looking forward to exploring the Demon Hunter, which is an amazing build, and also getting into Korvelain's personality and objectives. I think there's a lot of interesting discussion to be had there. So certainly looking forward to that. And the goal here is to produce 1 episode a week. So conceivably, we would get through Korvelain's playthrough, in a few weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how I split the episodes out. I tend to look for nice seams in the story, rather than just limiting myself to 60 minutes and abruptly cutting off in the middle of an adventure. I'll look for a place to cut it off where it kind of makes sense. So there'll be some variation in the length of these things. But the plan here is we'll have an episode next week. That will be Volume 1, Episode 2, where we will actually start adventuring. And I'm hoping to mix in here along the way some live streaming as well. That I'm still working on the details of. At this point, I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work. I've done some gaming live streams in the past, but typically I'm running at 720 when I do that. And so I would really like to do as much of Korvelain's story as I can at 1080p. So I'm going to explore that a little bit, if maybe do some testing offline, and if I feel like I'm getting good performance, we might do some 1080. I don't know if I can pull that off or not. We'll have to see. But my objective really here is to create the best possible footage I can for this. So I don't know. I'm keeping my options open at this point. So also, as far as other builds, I have a few in mind that I'm interested in, but I also would like to get your opinions. So in upcoming episodes, I will be publishing a form where you can nominate builds from Tamriel Vault that you'd like to see covered, and those will be compiled into a list, and then I will pick from that list of nominees and put a selection up for vote. So what builds I do here is they're not a foregone conclusion. I don't have any specific requirements around what level it is. It doesn't have to be a legendary build. It just doesn't. But to make it fair, what I would like to do is have people use the nomination form. And then once the nominations have been made, I will go through and pick out, 4 or 5 different ones from the list at varying levels of varying types with varying authors, etc. We'll try to get as much variety as we can, and then we'll put them up for a vote using a polling tool of some kind, either through YouTube or Twitter or something like that, right? We'll figure that out. And then we'll have some adventures with these different builds. Now, granted, if I'm doing 6 to 8 hours per build, there's going to be some time between, right? So, I'm not going to start another one until Korvelain is finished, but that gives us plenty of time to kind of go through this nomination process or whatever. So I could leave it open for 2 to 3 weeks to take nominations, and then we can kind of determine how we're going to do the selection. So I'm interested in getting your opinions about what you think of that, what you'd like to see, done, what you'd like to see covered, I guess. And then, any suggestions you have for how we can kind of run the nomination and voting process in a way that's convenient for everybody. I've got some ideas about how it might work, but I think there's other ways that we can do this as well. I've done similar things directly through YouTube before, using the YouTube system itself as a voting tool, and that is definitely always an option and certainly convenient. So let me know what you think in the comments. And you know what? I'm very excited about this. Thank you all for listening. I am going to leave you here with a little bit of footage of Korvelain and Lydia. And I look forward to seeing you in episode 2 of Korvelain, Demon Hunter.
You found the vessels. I was worried that I had sent you to your death. In life, Hevnorak drained his own blood from his body. His goal was to transfer his power back into himself after death, becoming a powerful lich. The vessels contain that very blood. Empty them, and you remove any chance he has of regaining his former powers. Very well. Empty the vessels into the sconce near the throne. Then sit in the throne. When you have done so, I will unbind Hevnorak. He will awaken in a weakened state, but the lich is still to be reckoned with. Be ready. Take Hivnorak's iron mask. It may be of use to you, and serve as some reward for your feat here.